Welcome, everyone, to We Give Summit. What a great song to end off on. For those of you who maybe saw me bouncing around in the chat, that playlist is one of my activism playlists, and I hope that you all are finding some inspiration in that. Thank you all for joining today, for finding your role in the social change ecosystem. Please note that if you need closed captioning, it's in that little square, as I like to do, with the CC. So just click that and we'll get things going. My name is Kelsey. I use they, them pronouns. I'm calling in from Massachusetts and Pawtucket tribal land, also known as Boston, Massachusetts. Today, I have a short curly haircut, short on the sides. I'm wearing a brown blazer with black drawing on it and a gray mock neck with a purple background. I am a senior program manager at Philanthropy Together. And if you're not familiar with us, we are a global initiative to grow and strengthen the field of collective giving with programming like We Give Summit. And today I am so excited for us to discuss and explore how we find our roles in social movements. Our speaker today, Deepa Iyer, is an amazing activist. And frankly, the book that she's going to be talking about is one that has given me personal inspiration and has acted as a North Star as I move through my own activism and work. In today's session, please engage with us in the chat. We're going to have Padlets and Mentimeters, so come ready to be reflective. And remember the two-question poll at the end. Stay with us till the end. There'll be a raffle and someone will get a book of their choice. Maybe it's the one we'll be talking about today. And I encourage all of you, as you're sitting in this session and thinking about your role, to consider donating to our pop-up giving circle on Grapevine. I will drop the link in the chat a little bit. We are raising funds for people in Gaza experiencing the extreme violence. And so we ask all of you today to stand with us, to activate with us together. I know one of the organizers of the emergency fund personally, and this is needed now more than ever, much like this session. And so on that note, I am unbelievably grateful and excited to meet our amazing presenter, Deepa Iyer. Deepa has been supporting local movements for over 20 years. She is a lawyer, a writer, an activist, and she is also on the advisory board of Emergent Fund, who we absolutely adore and love. They were speakers with us last year, and they are one of our partners. And so with that, it is with amazing pride and just excitement that I am going to pass it over to Deepa. Welcome, Deepa. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Thank you so much for your introduction. So generous, the shout out to Emergent Fund. I really want to thank you and the entire team for pulling this together and for the generosity that you all just talked about with the fund that you mentioned. I am so excited to be here with all of you to learn and discuss how we can utilize collective giving as a way to build a bigger and more equitable we. And I'm hoping to give you some resources and frameworks to add to your abundant toolkit that you're already working with in the work that you all are doing. So just a little bit about myself and where I do my work. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint. So give me a second to do that. And Kelsey, can you give me a thumbs up if it's showing up all right? Okay. So just a little bit about my point of entry into this conversation in this space. I'm an immigrant. I was born and raised in India, and I moved to the state of Kentucky when I was 12. So as you can likely imagine, the complicated experiences that my family had with belonging and othering really shaped my journey when it comes to social justice. And so over the last 20 years, I have been so humbled to learn from social movements that I've been part of, from leaders and community members, particularly in Asian, South Asian, Muslim, and Arab communities, which are my political and community homes. And now I am at an organization called the Building Movement Project, which is a national nonprofit that's been around for about 20 years. And we catalyze social change through research, relationships, and resources. And I have the honor of running a program called Solidarity Is at the Building Movement Project. We're engaged in uplifting solidarity, not just as a word or an ideal, but as a living daily practice. And we do that by playing 3 roles: builders, storyteller, and weaver. And more on these roles soon, and more about us if you are interested at www.solidarityis.org. So I have been using the word social change and will be using it quite a lot over the course of this conversation. So I wanted to take a moment to invite you to share in the chat what comes to your mind when you hear that phrase, social change. Maybe it's an image, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's a leader or a movement. I wanted to give you the opportunity to share and also introduce yourself so I can get a sense of who you are or where you're located. And I will check the chat on and off just to get a sense of who is in this space today and the different ways that we describe and understand what social change even means in our own lives and in our communities. So I'm going to give you a moment to respond to what you see on the screen. What image, phrase, or movement or person do you think of when you hear the words social change? All right, here are a few folks in the chat here, so I'll just pick up a few. Social change is happening whether we pay attention or not. I love that there's something organic and natural about it. Jamie says it's a way to get into good trouble. Absolutely. We'll get back to those words a little bit later. Nobody is free until we're all free, Taisha says, reflecting on Fannie Lou Hamer's very, very important quote. Social change equals reparations, a way of repair, a way of giving back, a way of correcting. Sharon says, it's a compounding and collaborative process that's responsive to the needs of many. I love that. So centering the needs of people and responding to them in a collaborative manner. I love that solidarity keeps coming up. Hi, Maya. Social change for me is a lotus rising from mud. I love that. All right, please keep writing in the chat. And it feels as though, I love this, Isis, social change is everyone here today. Absolutely, right? By showing up, we're making a difference. And it's so clear that each of us, right, whether or not we have these words or definitions around social change, there are certain feelings and images that we connote with it. And social change is absolutely, I think, our individual and our collective ambition, our responsibility, but it doesn't mean that it's always easy or effective. And we are contending with how hard it is, I think, in this moment. So I wanted you to keep in mind what you thought about or what you read when I asked you about social change as we move through the next couple of slides, which are a way for me to really touch upon and ground us in understanding that there are external and internal dynamics to doing social change work. On this slide, there are just a few images of the types of crises that a lot of communities in the United States and around the world are contending with right now. They are multi-layered and they're unprecedented because they seem as though they are coming at once and every single day. We're seeing threats to people's rights, to their bodies, to their livelihoods. We're seeing war and displacement, the genocide in Palestine that's on our minds on a daily basis, the climate crisis. We're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, transphobia. These are just some of the external dynamics that affect us on the daily. And for vulnerable and marginalized communities, it isn't something that's just out there. It affects us on a personal basis. But in addition to contending with these external dynamics, many of us are also dealing with internal dynamics. And what I mean by that is inside of ourselves or in the workplaces that we're part of, organizations, neighborhoods, schools, right? Any sort of ecosystem that does social change work. And I often use this image of a pressure cooker because in many conversations and trainings I do, when I talk to folks doing social change, they share that they feel the sense of often that they're in the midst of imploding or something is going to have to get released. They talk about how the stove feels very hot. The burners are turned all the way up in this metaphor. And I have put some names to the burners, so you might have others, but oftentimes we feel as though we're constantly tending to cycles of crises. We don't have enough resources, whether that's information, people power, funding. We're contending with trauma that we bring into spaces. Perhaps it's unhealed trauma, perhaps it's direct trauma, or it's vicarious. And we're in the midst of culture and practices in many of our ecosystems, workplaces, neighborhoods, organizations that force us to produce, to perform, to have a purity in terms of our analysis. And it's really difficult sometimes to know how to move. And so oftentimes we feel as though we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. We've dealt with this, and then 5 other things come up that we have to pay attention to. We feel like a wilting plant. More and more we hear from social change leaders that they are burned out, that they have nothing left to give, that they are at capacity. Or we feel as though we're not effective. We have goals and ideals, but we're not hitting them properly or fast enough. Or we feel as though we're on this seesaw of numbness and outrage back and forth on a daily basis. So perhaps some of these images resonated with you. Obviously, even in the midst of this, we're all holding on, right? We're holding on to hope. We're holding on to courage. We're holding on to each other. So there is possibility in this moment. And it is also, oh, shoot. I stopped my share accidentally. Sorry, Kelsey. I knew some of these, some technical issue would come up for me. Let me get back to it. But we also know that at times we are contending with these crises. All right. So what I want to do now is actually move us to asking you all to respond to this. Yes, here we are. So we're going to drop a Padlet in the chat, a link in the chat. And the question that I would like you to respond to over there, so you're going to click on the link and it's going to take you somewhere, is how do the external and internal dynamics of doing social change work today affect you, right? Or supporting social change work today affect you? You might think of some of those images that I put on the screen. You might think of your own commitments and reflect that back. And the way to work on this Padlet, let me just get to it and show you, if you've not used a Padlet before, is you want to click the plus sign that is at the bottom right. So it's going to look like this you can see it on my screen. It's going to click on the plus sign and it will allow you to write. Right, so you're going to respond to this question: how do the external and internal dynamics of doing or supporting social change work today affect you? Reflect on those images. You can, if you want, grab an image from the web and add it here as well, or you can just simply write. So let me give you a couple of seconds to do that. All right, so we're seeing some responses pop up. Really appreciate folks leaning into this question. Wow, someone even put in an image. I'm impressed. So just you can read these. I'm just going to pull up some of the themes that I'm seeing. Some days I'm fired up, right, to do more and to activate, and other days I just want to crawl under the covers. So being on that seesaw of being really activated or being withdrawn, that is absolutely normal. Sometimes our group enters freeze mode, lots of ideas, but our follow through falls away. Yeah. And when you say that, I'm reminded sometimes of our response to trauma, right? We either freeze or we fight. Organizations do that too. And it's not surprising that that's happening at times. Social change was my passion, and now it's my job, and it's become alienating. I think there should be another panel just on that. We hear that often, that the professionalization of social change takes away sort of the passion and the values. Also seeing a lot of folks talking about hope. I feel hope through it all. This beautiful picture of a plant coming through bricks. I have to remember it's a long game, and anything that happens on the daily is not the last word. Yes, the long arc of justice. We're coming together again so much to build the world we deserve. Absolutely. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being helpful or adding to the problem, feel overwhelmed. Great. Thank you so much for this. I believe in a just world, and in the moments when I feel disappointed or depleted, I ground and reconnect to my values. Totally understand the response to do whatever we need to do, right? Whether it's eating or whether it is indulging ourselves in order to cope, the coping mechanisms. My commitment to social change gets renewed every day when I can activate others. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. The Padlet is live, so you can go back to it if you want, but I'm gonna stop my share, and also want to pick up a little bit of what is in the chat, particularly around grief, an important practice of activism, and some of the other points that people are talking about. Social change is activating our 5 T's, says Sarah: talent, time, testimony, ties, and treasure. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So let me go back to where I was. So we talked a little bit about the importance of recognizing that there are these external and internal dynamics that sometimes conspire to make it difficult for us to engage in social change. And we also recognize that the world is demanding a lot of us right now, and a lot from us, right? And as many of you said, let's remember that we exist to meet this moment, right? That we are here to meet this moment using the tools that we can. And I would say that the ways in which a lot of us want to transform the current context we live in are embodied in this slide. Many of us, I think, are concerned about how we move towards the right part of this slide here. So how do we move from egos and logos to interdependence? How do we move from silo work to solidarity? How do we move away from this lack of innovation we often feel to more experimentation and vitality in our work? How do we go from this permanent crisis response to building long-term infrastructure that will address crisis now and also build, as some of you said, for the long run? How do we move away from these band-aids that we put onto to address issues because we're not looking at root causes, and look towards meaningful systems change? And how, finally, do we move from burnout and disconnection, which is absolutely normal, to finding ways to nourish ourselves, not just cope? So these are some of the questions I think about a lot in my work and the work that I do with movement leaders around the country. And that is really what has led me to offer this particular framework to you, called the Social Change Ecosystem Framework, or the Social Change Ecosystem Map. It's something I developed back in 2016 when I too was on a seesaw of numbness and outrage and didn't know how to plug in. And I looked back in many of the movements that I had been part of, and I realized that in many ways, it's just as simple as showing up very aligned in terms of our roles, which include the skills and strengths that we have, in service to a broader ecosystem. So I'm going to get into this in just a minute. It's a really simple framework to look at, but I promise you that if you work with it, it can lead you to some insights and aha moments. So this framework, and you will hear this time and again, really embodies a lot of the themes that we have heard, the lessons and wisdom that we have heard, particularly from women of color across decades. So in this framework, you'll hear a lot about the importance of self-awareness. As Nikki Giovanni has said, if you don't understand yourself, you don't understand anyone else. You'll also hear the importance of connection. So Grace Lee Boggs and Bell Hooks have talked about it's not about critical mass, but critical connections and building communities of resistance. And Yashna Padmasee has talked about moving from the individual to the collective. So this idea of an ecosystem. And so when we look at this framework, there are 3 components that we want to think about. The first component is to get grounded and regrounded in our core values. What brings us to social change work? Those values are embedded in the yellow circle in the middle of this map. Those were my values when I wrote this. You would have others to add. The second part of this framework is to identify the roles that we show up in when we are aligned with our values and in service to a bigger cause. There are 10 roles that I will go into that you may be playing already in your lives. And then finally, the last component is that everything is interconnected. It's a circle, it's not a ladder, there's not a hierarchy to it. Issues are connected, people are connected, the roles are connected. So a few other pieces to keep in mind with this framework is that it's a multidimensional framework, which means you can come to it as an individual, or you can use it as an organization, or you can even use it as part of a big coalition or movement. Another is to recognize that we want to enter this framework by thinking about what's needed right now. What is the movement asking me to do? Not what do I want to do? Right? So we want to think about what am I asked to do and what is the right role, what is the right relationship that I can bring to bear. This is also a framework that is focused on systems change. So it's not about I'm doing something because there's a crisis. I'm doing something because it is going to lead to a change in policy, culture, narrative, institutions, etc. And a couple of quick things as well. This particular framework helps us stay accountable to our power and privilege. So if we are finding that we are constantly being asked to play one particular role or that we show up in one particular role, we may want to self-reflect and identify ways to bring others in. And the last piece is that it's a framework that's all based on well-being. So we have to recognize that if we're playing 8 to 10 roles on this framework at any given moment, we're probably not actually effective and we're not going to sustain ourselves, right? So we want to think about the toll that it takes on us to play these roles. So for example, I have played the role of a frontline responder for much of my life. And I have also learned that when I do that, I get numb and I get impatient and I'm not effective. And so that self-awareness and recognition has helped me to make a different decision at times, to play the role perhaps of the guide who supports other frontline responders, rather than continuing to play a role that taxes me and doesn't help the movement. All right, so let me go through each of these components quickly, and we'll have a chance for you to map yourselves as well. So core values is pretty simple. We talk about values a lot. We put them up on our website, but oftentimes we don't live into them, right? We're all guilty of that. We're all learning and unlearning. So taking the time to actually understand what these words mean in real life to real people, taking the time to pause before we launch an event, a campaign, a cause, a fundraiser, and ask ourselves, how does this actually reflect our core values? And then after we're done with something like that, assessing, did our core values shine through? So an optional reflection question for you in the chat, what values are at the core of collective giving? So if you were actually in a workshop with me, I would ask you to map it out and write it down in the yellow circle. What would you put when you think of your core values that are important to you when you think of collective giving? So optional in the chat, feel free to write that in. I see people might be already doing that, which is wonderful. Trust, abundance, peace, centering community, beautiful. So that came so quickly to some of you. So really articulating it and then going back to it at every turn to ask, is this aligned, can help us to get more clear when we're feeling that overwhelm. All right, the second component are the 10 roles. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, but as I do, I would invite you to think about how these show up in your own life and in fact, in the collective giving circles that you're part of, right? It's multidimensional. So you can think about yourself and you can also think about an entity that you're part of. So weavers are those of us who connect the dots. We see the through lines between issues and ideas and geographies that seem discrete to others, but we see how they're connected. So we know, for example, that supporting reproductive rights is just is actually connected to immigration, right? Someone wrote in the Padlet that intersectionality often doesn't show up. Weavers are focused on finding the intersections. Experimenters are those of us who take risks. We are tired of the status quo. It doesn't have to be this way, even though we've done it like this 55 million times, right? And we course correct if it doesn't go right. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of experimentation, particularly with mutual aid associations being a form of giving, right? That's an experimental way of looking at collective giving. Frontline responders, I think folks are clear about that. We address community crises. We're on the ground. We know what to do. The Emergent Fund that Kelsey mentioned earlier that I'm on the advisory board of is a frontline responder in many ways because we're focused on supporting and resourcing communities that are on the front lines, right, on a monthly basis. Visionaries. Visionaries are those of us who see the North Star. We know where we're going. And not just that, we're able to articulate it, express it, and inspire others to come along with us. And just like every single role on this map, nothing can be done in silos. So visionaries cannot do this work without builders along their side. So who are builders? Builders are those of us who are developing the scaffolding between that North Star and the reality of today. We put together events, programs, we write resources, memos, we organize, delegate to get people to be in service of that collective vision. Caregivers and healers are similar and different. Both are concerned about a community of care and joy. And I saw joy come up a lot in the Padlet, which is wonderful to see. I saw healing justice come up. So caregivers are those of us who are focused on the community right in front of us, our clients, our grantees that we see every single day or connect with and talk to, our staff, our colleagues. Whereas healers are looking at it from a little bit of a meta approach. They are looking at how generational trauma winds itself through our bodies and our practices and our systems, and they bring to bear practices like somatic healing or restorative justice circles in order to tend to that trauma. Disruptors get into that good, necessary trouble that someone mentioned in the chat. So these are the folks who are doing very risky things to shake up the status quo. We often make others very uncomfortable with our actions because we're shutting down freeways or we're saying the thing at the staff meeting that no one else wants to say. But we're doing it in order to build power. And it's very important for disruptors, for this role in particular, to recognize power and privilege. Often disruption happens by people of color, by women, by femme folks, and it's also not fair all the time, right? So this is an invitation to those who have some level of privilege, and we all do at some level, to take on this role once in a while. Storytellers are those of us who are sharing our community stories, our culture, our histories through lots of different ways, particularly at a time when these stories and histories are being banned and rendered invisible. And finally, guides. So guides are those of us who have played another role on the map, and we know it well, so we can mentor, advise, and teach others who are playing that role with our well-earned discernment and wisdom. So, I want to ask you now, right? Now that you've had a chance to hear a little bit, and Kelsey earlier mentioned Social Change Now, the workbook that I wrote, it has a much deeper dive, a chapter on every single role. So if any of this is appealing to you, resonating with you, I would suggest that you take a look at that. All right, so we're dropping a Mentimeter link in the chat. And the question is, what 2 roles do you play to advance social change today? I know it could change, but right now, right, if you had to answer this question, what 2 roles do you play the most to advance social change? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to fill that out, and then I will show us the results. Thank you, Kelsey, for dropping it. Let me know if anyone has trouble getting to that link. It's in the chat. And as you all answer the link, I'm curious if you have any questions that are coming up for you. You can put them in the chat. There is going to be some time for Q&A, but I'm happy to also answer any questions that you might have that are popping up for you. All right. Folks are responding to the link. Let me go there myself and show it to you. So I know you're still taking it. Feel free. But I see that there are a lot of builders in this space. That's not surprising because many of us come into this work because we want to do something. We want to change something with our skills and our education, our knowledge, right? And so we seek to actually create organizations and other forms of resources. Followed by weavers, also not surprising. I would say those are probably the top 2 that come up in any room that I am in of folks who do social change. So weavers are the ones who connect the dots. They often end up being facilitators. They often end up saying, well, what about this? We didn't think about that. Let's bring that in. Or we are writing something on a particular issue, but we haven't covered all of the other ways in which it shows up, right? So that's what weavers do. I'm going to give you a couple of more minutes to see if there are any other responses. And I also see some questions coming in. Let me actually refresh. Oh, okay. When I refreshed, there was more. Great. Okay. So can you all see the, Kelsey, are you able to see the screen where I'm showing the responses?
Yes, the font explaining which ones they are a little, oh, that's so much better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can definitely see it.
I will also drop the answers, the link to the answers as well. Yeah. So we're definitely seeing, I think, weavers and builders in this space. And we're also seeing some experimenters and frontline responders. We're seeing caregivers. I think it's like a mix. I will say that in most spaces, what doesn't show up is healers. And that's one of the things that I'm always encouraging folks to think about in any ecosystem, that we want to really bring healers into our spaces because so much of our work is tending to trauma. Someone mentioned reparations earlier, right? So how can we uplift healing justice and healers in the work that we do and use language that is focused on healing. Another role that I often don't see as much in some cases is the role of the storyteller. And this is so important because when we do storytelling, we're conveying what we're doing to a much bigger public, right? And so, for example, if we are a collective giving circle that is focused on supporting Indigenous communities, how can we actually tell the story of the grantees we're supporting rather than just saying, here they are, and this is their mission, how are we able to actually thread the needle and tell a story about why they are doing what they're doing, right? So really thinking about incorporating, even if you fall as now I'm talking more as an organization, but if you fall as an organization in one role, think about how to meld something else that will actually be helpful to the collective whole. All right, so thank you for taking this. Continue to work with it. And Kelsey has also, I think, dropped some of the links in the chat as well. I'll answer a few questions. So why do you have us select only 2 roles, Carmen? Only because I have no time to do more. So if we were in person, or if this were a 90-minute workshop, which we might do actually over the summer with you all, we would have a little bit of more of a chance. But also, you know, we don't want to identify like, we always set a boundary, because we don't want it to be like, choose all the roles you play, because the goal again is to get really clear on what's needed from us at a given moment and then play that particular role. Another question that came up, Maria, thank you for your kind words. This is the first time I've had a hard time picking 2, so a little bit of a different response. Not feeling like an expert, but doing some coaching of movement leaders. Do you feel that coaching could emerge as a separate role, or how do you see movement coaching happening now in the future? Yeah, so coaching definitely is the role of a guide, right? Because you are imparting wisdom, you're showing a spotlight for the person you're coaching so that they come up with the answers themselves. And your wisdom is shown in the questions that you often ask, the inquiries, the discovery sessions, right? And so it's absolutely where I would put the role of a guide, the coach as a role of a guide. People often ask me if there should be new roles added to this framework. And of course, if you want to, you can. The thing to remember is that these roles are not job titles. They're actually about the way in which we show up. And so that is why I shy away from saying things like researcher, right? Because folks have asked, well, what about data researcher? And I say, well, that's a storyteller, because you are using data. If you're doing social change work, you're using the data to tell a story about what doesn't exist in the community and what should, right? Or some others will say, what about lawyers? And I say, well, frontline responders, right? So thinking a little bit more creatively about these titles and thinking of them differently. All right. Yeah, and so you know, when you work with this, you might actually think about how these roles shift for you, and they should, because social change work should not be stagnant. And part of what this framework offers us is the ability to switch and change depending on our own skills, our capacity, and what is required of us, right? Okay, another question. You shared your story earlier about pivoting out of frontline work. How do you decide which role you prioritize now? You know, it's funny, or maybe not funny, but I actually use this framework a lot myself on a personal level, because I want to play all the roles all the time. And it's actually been a great way for me to set some guardrails. I also ask my guides in the ecosystem to support me in not playing all the roles. So I often check in to say, I really want to do this frontline response. And I say that to a guide, and they will say, well, why? Why do you have to do that right now? And so for me, I think about whether or not I have to do it, or if there are others that I can support, right? So that's the privilege piece. I think about whether I have the tools to actually get it done well, if I'm going to be a frontline responder. I think about whether I have time. And I think about what it's going to do to me and the movement if I engage in it. Is it going to be of service or not? So these are some of the questions. And a lot of these reflection questions are in the guide that you can also use for yourself. All right, so I'm going to go back to my screen, my deck, because I have some more things I wanted to share with you. And I also am happy to take more questions as well. So please keep in mind that this is multidimensional. So think about it as yourself, but also think about it as your organization. And I will talk about that in just a bit right now. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we've seen collective giving circles even play these different social change roles, right? And so a few examples here The 7-Gen Giving Circle plays the role of a healer and a builder because they're really focused on how they can support economic revitalizations for Native Indigenous communities. And they're focused on food sovereignty initiatives. They're focused on supporting ways in which Native communities can heal, right? So there's multiple roles here, not just we're supporting it with money, but we're doing it for a certain purpose. Black Trans Lives Thrive, which supports Black trans leaders who are working hard to build thriving communities, plays the role of a weaver in terms of making sure that there are connections around, again, intersectional identities. So Black folks and trans folks, right, that are being recognized and not siloed. And then finally, the Hawaii People's Funds Giving Project can play the role sometimes of a guide and a storyteller, because what they do is that in addition to giving, they're also focused on personal storytelling and meaningful learning about classism and racism and its history in Hawaii. So these are just some examples of how we can think about our giving circles well beyond being donors, right? To think about what is the social change role that we're playing through our giving that could actually change systems and institutions. So I'm getting close to close. So I wanted to leave you with some steps, some next steps. So how can you use this framework, right? So first, please use it individually on a quarterly basis or whenever you want to. I often use it when I'm feeling really foggy about how to show up for a meeting even. But it will help you to think about, how can I show up in such a way that there is joy, that there is alignment with my values, that I am responding to context, right? I am I'm coming in with my highest self. So think about all of that. You can also think about it and use it when context switches around you constantly, right? When there are multiple issues or multiple changes, how do you show up? And you can think about it to figure out your own support system. So you are not alone in an ecosystem, right? So I mentioned earlier that as I play the role of a frontline responder, I rely a lot on guides to support me. I rely a lot on caregivers. I will often say, I'm entering rapid response mode. Can you please check in on me, to my caregivers, right? So we don't have to do this work alone. Second, use this as a collective giving circle, if you're a part of one, to identify and express the collective giving circle's roles. What roles is your giving circle going to show up as in the next year? That can guide your strategic planning. That can guide your communications. It can even guide your grantee practice and your donor practice. You can then use it to map out your grantee partners. So many, when we use this with philanthropic institutions or funder collaboratives, we will ask them to map their grantees out. And we often find where the assets are, right? So like this particular funder could be supporting a lot of, say, visionaries, but then we also look at the gaps. Are they also supporting storytellers who are conveying that vision? Are they also supporting builders who are building the scaffolding for the vision? So it can help you to understand how to diversify your grantee ecosystem. And then lastly, you can use this entire framework to shape your practices for collective giving as a whole. So for example, how do we, and this came up in the chat many times, going back to my initial question of social change, how are we centering the needs of affected communities? What are the core values that we're living into? How do we recognize history and think about its role when we are doing collective giving? How are we making sure that we're supporting organizing and healing? How are our practices making sure that there are very low barriers to apply, or maybe no barriers to apply? How are we actually building an ecosystem where we're asking our grantee partners to assess us and to evaluate the process? And I also urge you to do some stretching. So if you find that your collective giving circle is playing one key role, stretch yourself and find a second or third role. So for example, if you are a frontline responder collective giving circle, how can you think about telling the story of frontline response and what kind of infrastructure is needed, right? So thinking about how to connect these is vital. And lastly, take risks and push against the norms. We always hear that, supporting social change is risky because it's complicated, it's chaotic, it doesn't make sense. Those are all the norms of culture and practice on that pressure cooker that we have to push back against. And so I really urge you to do that, especially in this moment that we are in. Okay, so some final questions and clarifications if folks have any, or also, if you don't, what's coming up for you as you think about using this, right? How might you use this yourself or within the ecosystem that you're part of? So I see some responses around how I show up as a person in all aspects of my life. Yes, this can be helpful in that as well. It's an organizing framework, I think. I love the idea of using it for my team, right? So you can map out your team's roles. We do that a lot with organizations to identify what the roles of staff are. And then we ask, well, what's the role of the organization? And then we try to figure out where the gaps are.
Deepa, I actually have a follow-up question for you. And as folks, if you have other questions, we have a few more minutes left. You started to talk a little bit about the ecosystem element of that. Like when you were talking about when you step in as a frontline responder, you look to your builders. And I'm curious to know, what advice would you give to folks seeking to identify and map? And are there specific roles that you think play off of or need the support of other specific roles really well?
Yeah.
And I know for me, I think about it because I'm looking at my positionality right now, and I know that I'm a little bit of a healer and I'm a little bit of a disruptor, which sometimes is a really hard vessel to hold together.
It is.
And
But
so I'm curious to
recognizing
know more
that
about that.
tension, that's brilliant, because recognizing that tension is what will enable you to show up effectively in both, right? And recognizing both the possibility and the tension. Yes, the roles are complementary. So visionaries really do need builders and experimenters. Otherwise, it's just a big slogan, right? Disruptors and frontline responders really need caregivers. I would say that healers and weavers are vital in any ecosystem, and we usually don't involve them, but they're so important because they bring into space the community agreements that our vessel and our container is going to follow when there is inevitable conflict and disagreement, right? So the roles are complementary, and we don't have to play all the complementary roles, but we do need to know who's in our support system, right? So for you, Kelsey, if you are a disruptor and healer, who heals the healers, right? You too would need to identify your caregivers and to lean on them, especially if you're doing the disruptor role, and not lean just on yourself to heal what disruption can often do to your psyche and soul, because it does take a toll on us. So are there questions? There was a question on trainings. We do those. So on this slide, you can see that we at the Building Movement Project do trainings and workshops regularly on mapping our social change roles, on sustainability, on transformative solidarity, and even on planning for crisis response, which is something new that we've started to do. So reach out to us. This is actually our programming for the year in addition to what I just showed you, the trainings and workshops. So if you go to solidarityis.org, you will find all of this. We've got webinars on the state of solidarity in our country. We have got a rapid response ecosystem lab, and we have got a Solidarity Is cohort that is focused on training for emerging activists and organizers. And then lastly, the guide is an option if you're interested in more. I love a good workbook. So this guide is literally full of like places where you can write. And I want you to write in it. I want you to use it and not put it up on a shelf. You can also use this framework to do trainings for your own staff, for your own organization. Please feel free to do so. And if you want more information, all of my information is on the slide. I'm more of a disruptor on Twitter or whatever it's called, and more of a weaver on Instagram. So you can choose how you want to get doses of me. And then at the bottom are all of the websites where you can find more information. Thank you for having me. Thank you for everything that you all are doing. I'm going to turn it back over to Kelsey.
Oh, thank you so much, Deepa. I cannot stress enough how much this framework has been helpful for me in processing my own frustration and grief and like at times haphazard activism. And the exciting news, y'all, is keep your eyes out because I'm working with Deepa's team. We're going to bring Deepa back and we're going to bring Deepa's team members back because we know that this is really vital information that all of you need in this moment, particularly with everything going on in the world.